Dr. Khalil Gibran, Muhammad has a long bio here, so I may have to cut it a little bit. Khalil, please forgive me. He's the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and a former associate professor of history at Indiana University. In late 2010, he was selected to take over the helm of the historic Schomburg Center, which is currently celebrating its 86th year of existence. Dr. Muhammad, a native of Chicago's South Side, is an award-winning author. His book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, a must-read for everyone in this room, published by Harvard University Press, won the 2011 John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. As an academic, Dr. Muhammad is at the forefront of scholarship on the enduring link between race and crime that has shaped and limited opportunities for African Americans. He is now working on his second book, Disappearing Acts, The End of White Criminality in the Age of Jim Crow, which traces the historical roots of the changing demographics of crime and punishment so evident today.
I don't like to see people mistreated, and frankly, my commitment to truth-telling and to engaging issues grew out of a set of arguments about where I fit in. And that was a personal form of mistreatment that led me to a set of weapons. Call it historical literacy, knowledge, confidence, a willingness to speak up for others who did not have those same commitments. Because frankly, when I was in college, when I was just like you, I was innocent to the ways of the world in ways that many people don't have the luxury of. Even in 20 years, I would say that the life, particularly of young black and brown people, has changed significantly. But I was a privileged kid. I had a lot of things to look forward to, and yet even in that space, someone told me I didn't belong. Mm-hmm. And I decided from that moment to prove that I belonged. And then I decided that it wasn't just about proving where I fit in the world and making space for me, but it was about speaking up for those who did not have that voice.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad.
Producers of the new Bring It On musical.
Have that in mind.
That in mind. You know, I think that the benefits of activism are inspiring other people to express their passions, to find the courage, to take on the issues that matter to them. I mean, the truth is, for all the ways in which we in this room share a commitment to justice, it doesn't all look the same for us. And the more that I do the work that I do, the more that I realize that people see in me something more than I can give them. But the joy to me is to be seen. Because too many people are invisible. Too many people are invisible. In every facet of their lives, no one cares, no one listens, no one looks. And so I get to be visible, and that feels really good. It comes with a lot of responsibility. But visibility matters in this world. Collaboration, easier now.
Well, the first part is, why is it so difficult to achieve, and is it easier to do collaborative work now than it was in the past?
I'm torn about this question because I think that collaboration is difficult because egos get in the way. And I think that's a human characteristic that transcends time. And so in the work that I've done, the work that I've seen, the work that I've studied, organizations develop their own identities, and those identities become more important than the shared goals. And that's a lesson that many of you probably already learned just in some of your own campus activities. So I don't know that that's changed. I think what has changed is that social media has been able to stitch together a crazy quilt of people who have shared interests that would not otherwise find one another. Instead of getting on buses and going to the South, people get on the internet and go to their favorite social justice organization and connect. And they use Facebook and various means of communication. But I also think that the splintering of common enemies in this contemporary moment weakens the longevity of organizing. So let's take Occupy, for example. Occupy had the greatest potential in our most contemporary moment to galvanize a lot of young people with shared interest about what kind of economic future this country was headed towards. And it would replace neoliberalism with something far more compassionate. The currency of justice would be the prevailing organizing principle rather than profit and public safety. But that was a movement that struggled to reach beyond the vanguard of those who defined the interests, and we were all party to it, so we don't have to go back to explaining that. So I think that we should not fall asleep, that collaboration is very difficult. Collaboration requires subverting the ego. It requires sacrificing one's either organizational goals in the purest form or one's individual interests. I've been a part of a couple of task forces of various kinds that always seem to retreat back to the space of what's in it for me. So you have to be on guard against that. And the civil rights movement that we keep hearing about tonight had all of those challenges. And part of its successes was the sheer sacrifice of those who gave their lives for it, but also at the common enemy. They didn't take their eyes off of that prize. And I think that's the struggle the young people have today. What is that common enemy? I can't help but say you have to read the Bible. You have to understand, you have to channel what Immortal talked about in terms of some of the oldest ideas about what justice stands for. And it's not about reading the Bible as a kind of gateway to assuming Christian identity. It's about understanding the nature of power as it's existed in this country for at least the last 500 millennia. I'm sorry, I didn't say millennia, centuries. 5 centuries. Because I think that the language and the discourse about Judeo-Christian values have been inverted and have been turned into dominionism, have been turned into the right to a God-given claim to use the earth in any way and shape that people see fit. And one of the most significant and long-lasting organizing principles of capitalism has been to convert the earth to man's uses, whether it's fossil fuel extraction, whether it's mineral extraction, whether it's building railroads. All of it has been understood to be a mission from God to do that work. And so part of, maybe Immortal and I disagree on this, because I think part of the way to invert oppression is to understand the nature of that evil. Because otherwise you're not exactly sure what you're up against. Simply because I couldn't do the work that I do without having a command of history, probably more than anything else, because, and I'm going to say this to College of Criminal Justice folk. Everyone here is not planning to be a prosecutor or a forensic scientist or a commanding officer or any number of high-level administrative positions in the field, or simply professors in criminal justice. I know that many of you will go on to do other things far afield from that. But there is a technocracy that exists in this world, and its sole purpose is to demonstrate the importance of the industry of criminal justice. That's what it exists for. It does not exist to fund research to end punishment in the world. It does not exist to reinvent a paradigm of social control that would be based on compassion and fairness and justice, dare I say. So you have to be far more committed to an expansive, broad engagement with the past. Criminal justice as an academic discipline rewards historical knowledge only in the service of legitimizing the theories that make punishment legitimate. Circular use of legitimate, but you get my point. It does not move beyond the genealogy that substantiates what it doesn't. So it's incumbent upon you to read philosophy, to read literature, to take history classes that are not the history of crime and punishment, that are not the history of criminal justice. Because therein lie the possibilities for utopian imagination, that the system itself is not, it's not that it's not capable, it is not interested in it. It's no wonder that, and I've engaged some of Dolores' students, thoughtful students, but very much already committed to a way of existing in the world as members of a law enforcement community. And to me, that's a tragedy of educational opportunity. It's not one that Dolores was party to, otherwise I wouldn't have been in the classroom. But it says something about the paradigm that they've already accepted. This is the way it is. This is the way that it ought to be. And only broad exposure to humanities, only a deep reconciling of the contradictions of the world that we've received and inherited, and the world that might not be. Can you imagine a different way of being and doing and practicing something akin to justice in this world? Find your passion. There's always time for your passion. You are doing what gives you joy. You blowing your horn 14 hours a day, you fall asleep with it. Not borrow this man's metaphors. But if you are doing what you are passionate about, there are 40 hours in a day, and I can tell you that with great sincerity. Graduate studies, working. I have 3 kids. They're very young. I'm in Schomburg. Is very challenging. And I do everything that I care about. So if I don't care about it, I don't have time for it. I'm sitting between two brothers that are channeling the best of our spirits. I want to... No, I mean it, because one of the things I've been wrestling with is the absence of what I referred to earlier as utopianism. Before socialism entered the world as a form of government, when it was just an idea, it produced great works of socialism. One of the ones, speaking of that one book that I remember reading, was Every Bellamy's Looking Backwards. And that fiction, that form, Immortals talked about science fiction, gave and gives people access to reorder the world, to put flesh on the bones of a set of ideas that are almost too abstract to ever put in motion, too fanciful to take seriously. So I want to encourage all of you, write fiction, write poetry, be utopian. Go into that space where you can imagine anything and put it on paper. I play piano, I'm not all that good at it, but to me, it's a space where I get to be someone else that I am not in the world. It's not work. It's joy. And I think in that joy, you can find and you construct alternative realities that in the end, we actually need. And let me be clear on that needing. The space for reform created by Martin, and you all know this, but I'm just putting it in the conversation because I think it's relevant to this conversation, was partly made possible by the utopianism of an ex-convict with very little education in a cult religion, the Nation of Islam. And I say that not to disparage it, to say it in relation to the established religions of this country at this time. To have the audacity to imagine bringing up the greatest purveyor of power in the world to the court of the United Nations on genocide. I mean, think about that. Just pause. Think about each one of you with all the advantages that you already have by virtue of being here in the college. Being willing to say, I'm going to take all of my resources and credentials and credibility and bring the United States of America up on charges of genocide. That's what Malcolm X did. And that's what cost him his life. but that also made possible Martin Luther King. See, we need dreamers. We need people who are willing to not only imagine the impossible, but for a few of them to try to make it real. There are prison abolitionists among us. And I applaud them for that, because it's hard for me to imagine spending the precious little time I have on this earth working towards that goal. But I don't hate on them, and I encourage them, because we need them to help us imagine what comes next. So I think that there's no indication that the president has any plans on ending the war on drugs. I mean, unless I missed some policy statements that his surrogates have issued. And he's also made it clear that in his work, if you read Dreams from My Father, if you read Audacity, the president traffics in narratives of personal responsibility. He fundamentally believes that people who do well, who are well behaved, who study hard, who turn off television. You know, you've heard it all. I mean, he's telling us who he is. One of my favorite moments with the president was when he got upset with the Black left criticizing him. And he said, you all haven't been listening to me. Essentially saying that, you know, I am the centrist neoliberal that I've said I was. You all have put on me another set of expectations. Now, neoliberal doesn't mean there isn't space for anti-poverty. Doesn't mean that there isn't space for expanding social welfare. But it does mean that it's beholden to the marketplace. That it is beholden to a set of ideas that private interests should have access to governing society in ways that the public are by definition suspect. Obama fundamentally believes that the private sector can help guide government in its good works, which explains why Goldman Sachs is at the head of his economic policies. So I don't have a lot of faith that the president will take leadership on this. I do have faith that all of you, over the next 2 to 3 years, will make this an issue that, whether it was President Obama or anybody else in the White House, will be an issue they cannot ignore. Because that's where the first term was fundamentally flawed by the trade-off between his symbolism and the success of his presidency premised on a re-election. Well, there's no more re-election. So it's really not a question of what Obama's going to do on his own. It's really a question of what we're going to make him do. Communalism is not a system of government, but it's a way of life. And to the extent that people find local communities of shared interests, they will find ways to overcome the mythology of domination that will give them sustenance in the world. What I worry about is that too many of our young people passively receive narratives that promote domination, that promote avarice, that promote reforming. Cornel has talked about this repeatedly, idealism, that is about the me versus the we. And how you scale that up has not been seen. We have no historical precedent for what you describe. I mean, the parts of the world untouched by modern capitalism are parts of the world that are not premised on trade. They are self-sustained communities. Rousseau talked about the first moment at which man looked up and said, oh, he's bigger, stronger, prettier. And that at that moment of recognition came the origins of inequality. And once you have the recognition of inequality, the question is, what do you do with it? Do you harness it for the purposes of the group? We are not all equally endowed, either physically or with other various forms of gift, musicality, you name it. So the question is, what do you do with the nature of inequality in man, in woman? And that's where we've gone wrong, because we have decided to reward, to differentiate based on that inequality, not for the benefit of a small group or even a much larger. It reminds me of the term pacification during Vietnam. But what has gone, the point of no return is this. The cautionary note of the point of no return is this, that the Nation of Islam, for all that Dr. West so eloquently described, of all the ways in which I meet people in Harlem every single day who say to me, stop me on the street and say, your great granddaddy changed my life. He saved me from myself. And they need, and these are some people who you'd be surprised the positions they have in this city and elsewhere in the world. But what the construct of the nation was to reproduce the very symbols of success that are at base the core problem in our society. The nation created a shadow form of black capitalism. Now that's not to say that it wasn't premised on putting black people to work. But it did not reimagine the relationship between economic power within a community and the subjugation of people within that community. You understand what I'm saying? So we have to imagine forms of economic relationships that transcend the limits of what, I mean, it's the moment that James Baldwin in Fire Next Time is having a conversation after interviewing the life of Muhammad. And James Baldwin's whole point was not to embrace the cultural power of the nation. In fact, he was in great awe of it. But he had fundamental problems with economic nationalism as preached by the nation because he saw its inherent limits. He saw the limits of a nation that could not produce the natural resources necessary to manufacture the things that people needed to live wholesome lives. And that most of the money, is this like the time to go? That the very accoutrements of success were just a complete reproduction of what capitalist society. So James Baldwin said to the young man who was driving him uptown as he sort of very boldly said, I'm going to hang out with my white friends up on the north side of Chicago. If you remember the scene in Fire Next Time. And the brother was continuing the conversation about economic self-determination, economic independence, nationalism. We can do for ourselves. We have our own business. We don't need the white man's also. And he said, well, who made this car we driving in? Who's responsible for the rubber on the wheels? For the assemblage of this? Where does all this come from? And the point was the brother didn't have a response because he was only looking at the window dressing, the symbols of inclusion and power that were represented within the nation. So that was a limitation and not one that we want to reproduce. What I worry about for all of you is that the lessons of world history are that human beings will exploit each other, period. And we can be utopian about how to mitigate, how to imagine a world that has never existed, which I am promoting. But there is no point in human history to recover where human beings won't exploit one another. The only recovery from the past are degrees of exploitation. So who will build the pyramids of the future? And in assigning that task, the question is, will people have to die to build it? Because to me, that's the question that everyone in this room has to confront. Because you will inherit imperialism. You will inherit post-colonialism. The Arab Spring, for all of its potential, is devolving right before our very eyes. It is devolving. Because now the hard work of how do we run this thing faces every young person that stood up to tear down tyranny. What will you build up? What will you replace the world that we live in with? That's the hard work. And knowing who you are will get you only so far.
And a student here at John Jay. Sally founded an initiative called Youth International Empowerment, whose goal is to facilitate peer-driven space for sharing both struggles and solutions issues impacting the youth around the world. YIE's first trip was to Cairo, Egypt, last January to facilitate a series of workshops that encompass different ways of organizing through social media, outline numerous methods for blogging, and use videos to show the commonality of oppression around the world. YIE's venture was extraordinary and successful, as the group's 10-day trip contributed to a collective call for change that was witnessed worldwide through the use of technology. She is currently a John J. Bureau Fellow for the 2012-2013 year, and she interns at Safe Horizons anti-tracking program.
I think similar to Mr. Khalil Gibran, a more personal place. I grew up in a household of 6 individuals, 5 of which I have one older sister with Down syndrome. My mother died of cancer when I was 13 years old, and I was kind of left in the midst of everything, and I think coming from also an Arab household, which comes with another identity as well. I realized in some ways, and I think that Christina Gonzalez, who went with me to Egypt, in some ways that even with the mass poverty I saw in Egypt, that in some ways even me living in the US, it was so deeply connected, right? And the one thing I learned from the trip to Egypt, for example, is that all oppression is the same. No matter what planet you're on, or what city you're in, or what country you're in, all oppression is the same. And especially being able to be a young Arab American and comparing the different kinds of oppression I see, I've come to realize that in some ways my struggle is connected with everybody else's struggle, whether you're black, whether you're white, or whether you're brown, or whoever you are. And in some ways I want to bring those struggles together, and through that, my struggle becomes my revolution. And together, our struggles together can become our revolution. So I stay committed to that. I'm 22 years old, so I'm still learning what the benefits are, but I mean, so far I've not seen anything that I cannot have benefited from. But one thing I can say is taking an active role in activism, I can sleep at night, right? And to me, that's good enough. It's so funny because being the writing tutor at the Urban Mill Initiative, you know, students always come up to me and say, "Did you get arrested this time? Did you get arrested? Did you get arrested?" Which is kind of like, to me, it's like, whatever. But I can say the best benefit of activism is possibly sitting next to Dr. Cornel West in a cell. Cornel West, Mr. Carl Dix, Professor Jim Petros. I mean, these are the people you will be sitting with in jail, being an activist, right? And to me, it's the best thing that has ever happened. I'm going to have to say that I agree with everyone on the table, and I think coming from the perspective of a student activist, I can definitely say the issue that Dr. Khalil Gibran brought up of identities versus messages is a huge issue, and why in some ways I think that collaboration becomes hard. And I think that at the end of the day, it connects back to what I said earlier. I think that we need to forget about the identity aspect and forget the ego aspect. And I think that sometimes we have to be reminded that our struggles are all the same, and that any form of oppression is the same. And I think that's how we can coincide and come together. And I want to bring back to what Dr. Cornel West said earlier at an event that I went to. He said, "You hate the sin, don't hate the person." And I think that's something that we need to crucially remember in anything we do. Hate the sin, don't hate the person. I'm gonna get a laugh at a couple of my students when I say this, because, but I think that the book that I think sparked kind of my active part was a book that I was handed by a professor here at John Jay, she couldn't be here today, my freshman year, and it was Sex and Social Justice by Martha Nussbaum. Sorry, guys. So I think that the reason why I love Sex and Social Justice is because it made me confront a lot of things I was uncomfortable with confronting about myself and my role as a woman in contemporary day American society and Middle Eastern societies. And I think that confronting yourself with an idea is the same concept of having a white person confront them with white privilege and having to say this is a privilege that you have, right? Use it, right? And I think that that's what Sex and Social Justice gave me. It gave me that confrontation, that push I needed to look at the other forms of oppression that I hadn't seen before that. So Sex and Social Justice by Martha Nussbaum.
Anyone who'd like to know more, we can talk after the event. I've already made one of my points is you've got to decide what your contribution is going to be. That's point number one. Dare to be different. Point number two. Learn to be selfless and fearless, but not arrogant. work with like-minded people, search for the truth. Don't be invested in the popular or the common.
We let the Federal Reserve hijack the economy of the country, and these are things that we'll be taken task to. But unfortunately, those people will be dead before, you know, we ever have the opportunity to hold them to the letter of the law. And the reason is that they've decided to control what the law is. I said it on the Martyr. How can a government that's run by corporations regulate corporations?
You hate on the brother. No, I love the brother. He's a war criminal with a Nobel Peace Prize.